The priest noticed something strange about the bride and stopped the ceremony during the wedding. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Augustine's, casting vibrant hues across the expectant faces gathered within. The air hummed with anticipation, a symphony of hushed whispers and rustling programs. Yet, amidst this celebratory atmosphere, an unsettling stillness clung to the air, a palpable tension Father Michael couldn't ignore. He stood at the altar, his gaze sweeping over the assembled guests, a knot tightening in his stomach. This wasn't the joyous expectancy of a wedding, it felt strained. He glanced at Thomas, the groom, standing beside him, a nervous smile plastered on his face. His knuckles, white against the dark fabric of his suit, betrayed his anxiety. Thomas's parents, Robert and Elizabeth, sat rigidly in the front pew, their expressions unreadable, their bodies' language speaking volumes. Their silence was more deafening than any whispered disapproval. Father Michael shifted his weight, and the heavy weight around his neck suddenly felt constricting. He had known Thomas since he was a boy and watched him grow from a mischievous altar boy to the man standing before him today, ready to pledge his life to the woman he loved. But the love Father Michael saw in Thomas's eyes was tinged with a deep-seated worry, a fear he couldn't quite decipher. The organist began the processional, the familiar melody filling the church yet doing little to dispel the unease. Heads turned, eyes fixed on the back of the church as the bridesmaids, in flowing lavender gowns, began their slow walk down the aisle. And then, she appeared. Amelia, she was radiant, a vision in white lace and shimmering pearls. Her veil, delicately draped over her face, only partially obscured the soft glow of her skin, the gentle curve of her lips. But beneath the surface, Father Michael sensed a hidden turmoil. Her steps, though graceful, were measured, her grip on the bouquet almost painfully tight. As she drew closer, he noticed the subtle tremor in her hands and the slight stiffness in her posture. This wasn't the nervous excitement of a bride, it was something deeper, a quiet apprehension that resonated with the unspoken tension in the room. He observed the guests, their reactions to Amelia's entrance a mix of forced smiles and thinly veiled disapproval. The whispers intensified, carrying snippets of judgment that chilled Father Michael. The stares, particularly those from Robert and Elizabeth, were not those of concerned parents, they were laced with a coldness, a disdain that cut through the celebratory facade. At that moment, Father Michael knew this wasn't just a wedding, it was a battlefield. And Amelia, the bride, was walking into it alone. As Amelia reached the altar, her eyes met Thomas's. For a fleeting moment, the tension seemed to dissipate, replaced by a shared look of love and reassurance. But the respite was short-lived. The moment Robert stood, the air crackled with a palpable shift in energy. He positioned himself squarely in front of Amelia, his face contorted in a mask of disapproval. "I'm sorry, Father," Robert's voice boomed across the church, silencing the hushed whispers, "but this wedding cannot go on." A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Thomas's face paled, his eyes darting between his father and Amelia. "Dad, what are you doing?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Robert ignored his son, his gaze fixed on Amelia. "We've been deceived," he declared, his voice dripping with accusation. "This woman, Amelia, she's not who she claims to be." Elizabeth, Thomas's mother, rose to stand beside her husband, her expression mirroring his disapproval. "She's only after Thomas's money," she added, her voice laced with venom. "She'll never belong in this family." Amelia's breath hitched, her eyes widening in disbelief. The veil she held now trembled visibly in her hand. The carefully constructed facade of composure began to crumble. Father Michael felt a surge of anger. He knew Amelia, knew the kindness and sincerity that lay beneath her quiet exterior. These accusations were not just cruel, they were baseless. "Robert, Elizabeth," he began, his voice firm, "I understand your concern, but—" Robert cut him off, his voice rising. "Concern? Father, we had her investigated. Her family, they're nothing. She comes from nothing. She's manipulating Thomas, using him for his family's wealth and status." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken prejudice. The veil, the shield that had partially concealed Amelia's face, now seemed to magnify the hurt and humiliation in her eyes. It was then that Father Michael understood. This wasn't about money, it was about something far more insidious. It was about race, about the background, about a deep-seated prejudice that masked itself as a concern. He looked at Thomas, his face etched with conflict. He was caught between his love for Amelia and his ingrained loyalty to his family. His silence spoke volumes. Father Michael turned back to Amelia. Her eyes, once filled with hope, now shimmered with unshed tears. He knew he couldn't continue. Not like this. I think, he said, his voice calm but firm, that we need to postpone this ceremony. A wave of murmurs swept through the church, the hushed whispers now escalating into audible gasps and exclamations. The carefully orchestrated wedding had dissolved into chaos, the beautiful facade crumbling under the weight of Robert and Elizabeth's accusations. Amelia, her face now pale and drawn, stood frozen, her eyes fixed on Thomas. He met her gaze for a fleeting moment, a flicker of pain and indecision crossing his features before looking away. Her shoulders slumped, the bouquet in her hand trembling. The fight seemed to drain out of her, leaving her looking vulnerable and exposed. She turned, her eyes meeting Father Michael's. In that shared glance, he saw a profound sadness, a quiet resignation. She gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of the inevitable. Without a word, she turned and walked back down the aisle, her measured steps echoing in the sudden silence of the church. The bridesmaids, their faces etched with shock and confusion, followed her, their lavender gowns a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere. Father Michael turned to face the congregation, his gaze settling on Robert and Elizabeth. Their faces once contorted in anger, now held an air of smug satisfaction, a chilling display of their perceived victory. I apologize for this unfortunate interruption, Father Michael announced, his voice strained. I believe it's best if we all take some time to reflect on what has transpired here today. The guests began to disperse, their hushed whispers filling the air once more. Some glanced at Robert and Elizabeth with open disapproval, others with a morbid curiosity. The church, once filled with the promise of joy, now echoed with the remnants of a shattered dream. Thomas stood rooted to the spot, his face ashen. He watched as Amelia disappeared through the church doors, the weight of his family's actions pressing down on him. He hadn't spoken, hadn't defended her. He had allowed his family's prejudice to overshadow his love. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He turned and ran, pushing past the lingering guests, desperate to reach Amelia before it was too late. He burst through the church doors, blinking against the bright sunlight. He scanned the crowd dispersing outside, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw her then, a solitary figure in white, walking away from the church. "Amelia," he called, his voice hoarse. She stopped, turning slowly to face him. Her eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, held a mixture of sadness and resignation. He reached her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Amelia, I'm so sorry," he stammered, his words inadequate, insufficient to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. She looked at him, her gaze piercing, seeing through his apologies to the deeper conflict within him. "Thomas," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "you didn't stand up for me. You let them tear us apart." "I know," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I was shocked. I didn't know what to do." "You could have chosen me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You could have told them they were wrong. But you didn't." I love you, Amelia," he pleaded, reaching for her hand. She pulled away, her eyes filled with a profound sadness. "And I love you, Thomas. But love isn't enough. Not when it's pitted against this hate." She turned and walked away, her steps resolute, leaving him standing there, alone, in the shadow of the church. Thomas watched Amelia disappear into the crowd, the weight of his inaction crushing him. He had failed her. He had failed their love. He stood there for a long time, the sounds of the city fading into a dull roar as he grappled with the consequences of his silence. He had always known his parents held reservations about Amelia, subtle hints of disapproval disguised as polite concern. But he had never anticipated this public humiliation, this blatant display of prejudice. He had underestimated the depth of their bigotry, their inability to see beyond their narrow-minded worldview. He sank onto the steps of the church, burying his face in his hands. The image of Amelia's stricken face, the pain in her eyes, haunted him. He had allowed his family's prejudices to dictate his actions, to silence his voice. He had chosen their approval over her love. He thought back to the beginning, to the moment he first met Amelia. It had been at a charity gala, a world away from the stifling confines of his upbringing. She had captivated him with her intelligence, her wit, her quiet strength. She had seen past his family name, past his privileged background, to the person he truly was. She had accepted him, flaws and all. And he had loved her for it. He had believed their love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle. He had been wrong. He had allowed his family's expectations to define him, to shape his choices. He had lived his life according to their rules, striving for their approval, fearing their disapproval. He had never truly been his own man. He lifted his head, his gaze fixed on the church doors. The stained glass windows, once symbols of hope and faith, now seemed to mock him, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the emptiness he felt inside. He stood up, a newfound resolve hardening his features. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could learn from it. He could choose a different path, a life defined by his values, not his family's prejudices. Thomas returned to the church, the echo of his footsteps amplifying the emptiness of the sanctuary. He walked towards the altar, the same altar where he had stood just hours before, ready to pledge his life to Amelia. He saw Father Michael still standing there, a look of quiet concern on his face. "Thomas," Father Michael said softly, his voice filled with compassion. Thomas met his gaze, his own eyes filled with a mixture of shame and resolve. "I need to talk to them," he said, his voice firm. Father Michael nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. He led Thomas to a small room adjacent to the sanctuary. Robert and Elizabeth were sitting there, their faces grim. They looked up as Thomas entered, their expressions shifting from surprise to apprehension. "Thomas," Robert began, his voice laced with caution, "we need to talk about what happened." Thomas cut him off, his voice shaking with suppressed anger. "No," he said, his gaze fixed on his parents, "you need to listen. You need to listen to what you've done." He told them about Amelia, about her kindness, her intelligence, her strength. He told them about their love, about the future they had planned together. He told them about the pain they had inflicted, the damage they had caused. "You were wrong," he said, his voice rising, "you were wrong about her. You were wrong about everything." Robert's face hardened. "We were only looking out for your best interests," he said, his voice defensive. "My best interests?" Thomas repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "You humiliated her. You humiliated me. You tore us apart with your prejudice and your bigotry." Elizabeth's face crumpled. We didn't want you to make a mistake," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The mistake," Thomas said, his voice low and steady, "was yours. You let your prejudices blind you to the truth. You let them destroy something beautiful." He turned and walked away, leaving his parents sitting there in the stunned silence of the small room. He walked out of the church, the weight of his family's legacy lifting from his shoulders. He had finally broken free. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the city streets as Thomas walked, his mind racing. He needed to find Amelia. He needed to tell her he understood that he had chosen her. He hailed a cab, giving the driver Amelia's address. The journey seemed to take forever, each passing minute amplifying his anxiety. He pictured her alone in her apartment, surrounded by the remnants of their shattered dreams. He had to make her understand. He had to make things right. The cab pulled up outside her building. He paid the driver and rushed inside, his heart pounding in his chest. He took the elevator to her floor, his hand trembling as he pressed the doorbell. He waited, the silence amplifying his apprehension. The door opened slowly, revealing Amelia. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale, but her expression was composed, almost serene. "Thomas," she said softly, her voice betraying no emotion. "Amelia," he began, his voice hoarse, I had to see you. I had to tell you." She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The apartment was quiet, the air thick with unspoken words. He stood there, unsure how to begin. "I spoke to them," he finally said, his voice low. "I told them they were wrong." She nodded, her eyes searching his. And I chose you," he said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "I choose you, Amelia. I always will." Amelia's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were tears of relief, of understanding. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I'm glad, Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But it's too late." He looked at her, his heart sinking. "What do you mean?" "I can't do this anymore, Thomas," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "I can't keep fighting this battle. Not alone." He understood. He had left her alone for too long and had allowed his family's prejudices to dictate his actions. He had failed to protect her, to stand up for their love. He had broken her trust, and now there was nothing left to salvage. He nodded, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. He knew she was right. He had caused too much pain, too much damage. He had lost her. He squeezed her hand, a silent farewell, and turned to leave. He walked out of the apartment, the weight of his loss crushing him. He stepped out into the night, the city lights blurring through his tears. He walked for a long time, lost in his thoughts, replaying the events of the day. He had lost Amelia, but he had gained something, too. He had gained a sense of self, a newfound clarity. He had broken free from the shackles of his family's expectations, from the suffocating weight of their prejudices. He had finally chosen his path. He stopped, looking up at the night sky, the stars twinkling like distant hopes. He had a long road ahead of him, a journey of self-discovery and healing. But he was no longer afraid. He was free. He turned and walked on, leaving the shadows behind, stepping into the uncertain light of a new beginning.